So, John, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with me today. Let me just ask you, first of all, tell me about yourself and what is your role within the UK Noise Association?
Well, I chair the UK Noise Association, and I've done that for quite some time. My own background is in transport and in noise. I've worked in transport for many more years than I care to remember. And over the last 20 years or so, I've also done a fair bit of work on noise issues.
So tell me about the scope of the UK Noise Association. What areas, what do you cover? What are the sort of issues that you campaign on?
Well, we cover all aspects of noise. We do more work on some than others because some aspects of noise, like, for example, aircraft noise, there's a lot of groups which specialize in that. So we maybe try to complement rather than repeat what they do. But we do cover all aspects of noise, and we do cover the whole country. So, from the north of Scotland to the very south of England.
Let's talk about London specifically, because I know that that's been a very big area. In London, is it more of a traffic issue? Is it like loud noise in people's houses issue? What are the sort of things that affect London in particular, do you think?
It's a mixture of things. Traffic noise is a problem in London, and particularly for the main roads, because they're so heavily trafficked. But neighbour noise is also a problem, partly because people live in very dense areas, a lot of flats, a lot of shared housing, and particularly in low-income areas, neighbour noise can be a problem. And these days, with local authorities having less resources to deal with it, it can be an unresolved problem. I suppose the other problem for London is the presence of two airports, Heathrow and London City. Both of them have flight paths going right over London, and while it's been quieter during COVID times, aircraft noise is a serious problem for London. And in fact, London is more overflown than any other major city in Europe.
So what are some of the things that people talk about locally?
I think locally, it tends to be neighbour noise. It tends to be noise, the next door neighbour making a racket, or noise in the street. Those are the most local things. They can be really very, very disturbing because there's often no escape from them. And while there is legislation which can deal with it, there's noise legislation, there's antisocial behaviour legislation, the process can sometimes be very slow. And I think particularly people don't know their way around the system or don't have too many resources, they can sort of feel they're left with the noise. There's no escape. I think the no escape situation probably makes the noise feel even worse.
And how does that feeling of having no escape contribute to people's well-being, their way of life? Because I imagine it must take quite a toll on them.
It does. People can get stressed out. And they get stressed out partly by the noise, but particularly if they feel there is no escape. If they feel there's very little they can do about it, or the fact that nobody else is doing anything about it. And stress can lead to all forms of tension and illness and the lack of well-being.
How big of a problem do you think this is? Have you seen any research on this, or have you done any research on this? What the scale of the issue?
The scale is enormous. It's reckoned that there's across the country as a whole, there's a neighbour noise complaint made every 80 seconds. Now that is quite phenomenal. I don't think it hits the headlines because they tend to be individual complaints, made to individual local authorities. But the scale of the problem is enormous. I've called it an epidemic. And I think it's an epidemic that is not really been acknowledged, far less dealt with.
So as a group, what sort of things have you campaigned for to resolve these issues?
We're very keen as a group to not just highlight problems, but campaign for solutions. And we do think there are solutions for most noise problems. With neighbour noise, it is a question of the authorities taking the noise seriously and dealing with the noise offender. Now, sometimes with the noise offender, it's just a question of having a quiet word. And if they're a reasonable person, they think, oh yes, I'll cut down the noise. But if the noise persists, our view is that the local authority should get quite tough on the noise offender and confiscate equipment, and if the worst comes to worst, evict the person. So the laws are there. They need to be enforced. They need to be enforced sensibly, but also, when need be, very forcefully. With traffic noise, there are solutions. Slower speeds reduces noise considerably. We would like also to see less traffic on all roads in London, because that would reduce noise, and that really does mean investment in other forms of transport, buses, public transport, walking, cycling, perhaps eventually some form of road user charging. But again, the solutions are there. With aircraft noise, the solution is a little bit more difficult, but what we would like to see there is for flight paths to be alternated so that the same community is not being flown over all day long. You can't get rid of aircraft noise, but you can mitigate the impacts of it. And I think our frustration is that while that noise is not generally an unresolvable problem, but the authorities very often are not resolving it in the way that they could, and that's frustrating.
Why do you think that is?
I think partly it's lack of resources, but I also think there's not a recognition that noise is as important as it is to many people. There are other environmental issues which are issues of importance, and particularly climate change, and that soared up the agenda. Air pollution too. And I think many in authority are more eager to deal with and put resources into climate change and air pollution than they are noise. We've long called noise a Cinderella pollutant, and I'm afraid Cinderella still hasn't been rescued in order to go to the ball.
You mentioned climate change there. Do you think there's been an impact with the expansion of ULEZ in the capital, and maybe fewer cars being on the road or more electric cars being on the road produce less noise?
You know, I think that's right. I think in some ways, although ULEZ and electric cars are being introduced for reasons other than noise, noise benefits from them. And certainly at lower speeds, and certainly the speeds that take place in most towns and cities in the UK, once electric cars come in, that will be of a considerable help to reducing noise, even though that wasn't the main reason for them being introduced.
Because one of the things I've heard from people is that often in areas like central London, you'll have people with big sports cars, for example, tearing down roads, and they create huge amounts of noise. And that's apparently been quite a bit of an issue quite recently.
That has been a huge issue. These souped up cars, these boom cars, and in some ways, people get more annoyed about that than the regular traffic on a main road, because the regular traffic, a lot of people can get used to because it is regular, because it's consistent. These boom cars come out of the blue, they're spasmodic, and because of that, and because of the type of noise they make, very annoying. What is encouraging is that some of the local authorities, particularly those in central London, are introducing acoustic cameras, noise cameras, which can identify which cars are making the noise, which are the boom cars, and the owners will be fined. We think that if the cameras work properly and the fines are high enough, and they may need to be very high if you're a high earner in Mayfair with a smart car, but if they're high enough, then that again is a problem which can be solved.
And how effective do you think enforcement of that has been, or do you think it should be?
It's too early to say because the cameras really just have recently been installed. But the technology is there to identify the cars, and if the fine level and if they are identified and the drivers are apprehended and then fined at an appropriate level, then actually one can't say for sure, but I think there's a real chance that we can get on top of that problem.
I've also had a look at initiatives in different parts of London. I know in Bromley they introduced a noise barrier. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. How significant do you think initiatives like that are on a more local level?
Yeah, noise barriers can be important. I mean, noise barriers are quite expensive to install, but on certain occasions they really can reduce and sometimes cut the noise completely. So if you've got, for example, people living very close to a busy main road, put up a noise barrier and their lives can change dramatically. So they do have a role, but as I say, they are really quite expensive to install in a fairly widespread way.
Tell me about low traffic neighbourhoods, because I understand these have been very controversial in London. First of all, what are they? What are low traffic neighbourhoods and why are they so controversial?
Well, low traffic neighbourhoods are areas where through traffic is not really permitted. And that happens across a wide area by using a range of barriers and things to stop through traffic. It doesn't stop residents driving to their own homes, but it does stop the running and the through traffic. For the people living in low traffic neighbourhoods, they're wonderful. There's less pollution, there's less noise, children can cycle and walk in with much less road danger around. But the problem is, and this is why they're so controversial, that the traffic that was going through those neighbourhoods is now going back on to the main roads, or in some cases what they call the boundary roads, that's the roads around the low traffic neighbourhoods. And as a result, the people living on the main roads and the boundary roads are already, very often the main roads are the most heavily trafficked roads. They are getting more congestion, more pollution, more noise. And the big question in my view as to whether that is fair to give some people a little bit of paradise at the expense of other people. And the other issue here is that, although it's not absolutely clear cut, but lower income people tend to live disproportionately on main roads, on the busy roads, because the property is cheaper. Also, people from ethnic minorities live disproportionately on those roads. And there is, I think, an issue of environmental and racial justice here.
Why do you think so many local authorities are keen to roll them out and have been doing so for many months and many years?
I think they're keen to do it because they're getting money from government. And I'm not blaming them for this. But they're getting money from government to introduce low traffic neighborhoods. And to be quite honest, if you are getting some money and you can do something for some of the people in your local authority area, you'll do it. So no blame on them, but the consequences for the people living and for their own residents living on the main roads is not good at all.
What do you think it will take to increase the political will? Could be at a Westminster level, but also at a local London level, the Mayor of London, London Assembly. What do you think it will take to get more people to listen to the message that you're putting out?
I mean, that's a $64,000 question, really. I don't think one can generalize that over noise as a whole and say suddenly, we would love this, but suddenly the local authorities, the Mayor of London or the national government will take noise as such seriously. But what I think may well happen is on particular noise issues, if there's enough pressure, noise will be taken seriously. So the best example in London is probably the big campaign there has been for many years, decades, against the third runway at Heathrow. And that's largely, as far as residents are concerned, based on noise issues. And because of that, the third runway, rightly or wrongly, but the third runway hasn't happened. So that's a particular noise issue where there's a lot of pressure. I think the consequence of low traffic neighborhoods putting more cars on main roads and boundary roads and increasing the noise and pollution there, that may well result in a campaign from those people for the noise to be dealt with. Neighbor noise is more difficult. And it's more difficult because I was saying earlier, it tends to be individual. It's hard for, unless an entire neighborhood has been disturbed by, one set of very noisy neighbors. It tends to be an individual thing. And it's often people who are low income, who don't have the time and sometimes the resources to fight back. And that is going to be a real challenge to get local authorities to take those seriously.
Do you also look at things like housing and people's windows, for example? Do they have double glazing or do they not have double glazing? Do you look at that and how much of an impact that has on people?
We do. We did a study some years ago now, which showed that across the country, probably running into millions of people it was difficult to find out a precise figure, but probably running into millions of people are living in homes which are poorly insulated as far as sound is concerned. Again, there's an answer to this. It's quite an expensive answer, but there's an answer to this. We think there should be a rolling program of sound insulation, starting with the worst affected properties and moving over perhaps the coming decade to cover all properties. But again, we're faced with this question of whether noise is regarded as high as other pollutants, because the big push right now is for thermal insulation because of climate change. Now, again, it's something that is good, but it would be a pity if while it's been done, acoustic insulation to deal with noise was not done at the same time.
Fascinating, because even for me, I mean, I live on a main road, and because I have double glazing, I've never really had much of an impact of it. So even I can say that, from personal experience.
I think that's absolutely right. I think there are actually some quite simple things like double glazing, which can sort noise problems out. And the example you give of living on a main road and not really being disturbed by the traffic is simply down to double glazing. Our view is that it's homes on main roads, for example, where there's a lot of traffic, a lot of noise, that they should be first in line to get double glazing and other things which would help make the house less noisy. There's not really a program, and local authorities and government are not really, they've got no strategy at the moment for this, but it's something that could be easily done and could benefit people quite quickly and quite substantially.